Tony Blair defends his decision to go to war with Iraq and says he still believes it was right to topple Saddam Hussein.
This isn't about a lie or a conspiracy or a deceit or a deception. It's a decision. If there was any possibility that he could develop weapons of mass destruction, we should stop him. That was my view. That was my view then, that's my view now.
The former Prime Minister gives a confident performance during 6 hours of questioning before the Iraq inquiry. Mr. Blair says 9/11 changed everything, and from that moment, the risk posed by Iraq became too great to be ignored.
Tony Blair! War criminal!
A small but vocal group of protesters gathered outside the Iraq inquiry, and inside, relatives came to find out why their loved ones had been sent to war and lost their lives. After the much-anticipated appearance by Mr. Blair, how much closer are we to getting answers about the Iraq war? Also tonight, Toyota recalls thousands of cars because of safety fears concerning the accelerator pedal. And Charles and Camilla pay their respects at Wootton Bassett as the bodies of 2 more soldiers are brought home.
On BBC London, the man on trial for murdering a colleague and scattering the body parts changes his plea to guilty. And Chelsea captain John Terry loses a High Court battle over his private life.
Good evening, welcome to the BBC News at 6. If he appeared nervous at first, it was an increasingly confident and unrepentant Tony Blair who appeared before the Iraq inquiry today. The former Prime Minister explained why he believed then and still believes now that going to war with Iraq was the right decision. He claimed that after the attacks of 9/11, what he called the calculus of risk had changed, that Saddam Hussein and what were thought to be his weapons of mass destruction could no longer go unchallenged. Mr. Blair said not a day went by, even now, that he didn't think about his decision to go to war. This report from Nicholas Witchell contains some flash photography.
He arrived in the half-light of dawn to the sound of a single bell tolling. Tony Blair's convoy headed for the basement. Moments earlier, he'd slipped in through a side door. It was a low-key start to a highly charged day.
Tony Blair! War criminal!
In the streets around the conference centre were the protesters, not as many as some had predicted, a couple of hundred at most, whose verdict on Tony Blair has already been decided.
Blair right! Thousands die! Blair right!
Security was tight, tempers were occasionally frayed.
We're going to have a police state, at least organise it properly!
Standing in line were some of those whose lives were changed by the Iraq War. These were some of the families who lost sons and daughters and husbands, waiting for their chance to hear the former Prime Minister in person. At 9:30 sharp, the session began. Mr. Blair took his place. He looked pensive.
Good morning.
Morning.
I would like to start by welcoming our witness.
Sir John Chilcot said many people wanted answers, but he reminded everyone that this wasn't a trial. And so the Iraq inquiry began its questioning. They went to the event which changed everything, 9/11, and Tony Blair was soon in his stride.
The crucial thing after September the 11th is that the calculus of risk changed.
That meant, Mr. Blair said, that someone like Saddam Hussein, with his history of defiance over weapons of mass destruction, had to be confronted.
The primary consideration for me was to send an absolutely powerful, clear and unremitting message that after September the 11th, if you were a regime engaged in WMD, you had to stop.
Mr. Blair flatly denied the suggestion that he'd signed in blood with George Bush in April 2002 to invade Iraq. But he did say that he wanted Britain to be alongside the Americans.
And I'd said we would stand shoulder to shoulder with them. We did in Afghanistan, and I was determined to do that again.
So what precisely had George Bush understood from that?
What he took from that was exactly what he should have taken, which is that if it came to military action, because there was no way of dealing with this diplomatically, we would be with him.
Then to regime change, an illegal policy, but had Mr. Blair embraced it?
No, the absolutely key issue was the WMD issue.
But the line between regime change and disarmament seemed at times to be blurred.
I think there is a danger that we end up with a very sort of binary distinction between regime change here and WMD here.
And then there was Mr. Blair's recent BBC interview with Fern Britton, in which he did appear to endorse regime change.
If you had known then that there were no WMDs, would you still have gone on?
I would still have thought it right to remove him. I mean, obviously,
Mr. Blair seemed to say that he hadn't been fully prepared when he did that interview. He'd misspoken.
I did not use the words regime change in that interview, and I did not in any sense mean to change the basis. Obviously, all I was saying was that you couldn't describe the nature of the threat in the same way if you knew then what you know now.
On the Iraq dossier of September 2002, Mr. Blair defended his categoric statement that he believed beyond doubt that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction.
I did believe it. I mean, that was and I did believe it, frankly, beyond doubt.
Mr. Blair was satisfied that the invasion had been lawful. He believed contrary views in Cabinet had been heard. He believed Britain had had proper plans for the aftermath. And Mr. Blair believed he did the right thing.
Say to people, this isn't about a lie or a conspiracy or a deceit or a deception. It's a decision.
In the same situation, Mr. Blair said he would take the same action again.
I had to take this decision as Prime Minister, and it was a huge responsibility then, and there's not a single day that passes by that I don't reflect and think about that responsibility, and so I should.
And no regrets?
Responsibility, but not a regret for removing Saddam Hussein. I think he was
Be quiet, please.
I think that he was a monster. I believe he threatened not just the region, but the world. And in the circumstances that we faced then, but I think even if you look back now, it was better to deal with this threat, to deal with it, to remove him from office. And I do genuinely believe that the world is safer as a result.
He'd spent more than 6 hours at the witness table. Anyone hoping for a grilling will have been disappointed. It was an at times passionate defence by Tony Blair of his decisions on Iraq. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, at the Iraq Inquiry.
So after 6 hours of intense questioning, what have we learned from Tony Blair's evidence and what impact will it have? Here with his assessment is our Deputy Political Editor, James Landale.
Never has a former Prime Minister been questioned so publicly for so long over a decision that so divided the nation. Tony Blair has faced other inquiries on Iraq, but never with the stakes so high, the focus so sharp. 7 years on, he's still defending a war that cast a shadow over his premiership and some say over politics itself. For 2 years now, he's largely stayed away from the cameras, but today, with the eyes of the world upon him, he returned to the stage for perhaps his last real chance to make the case for war. The tan's a little deeper, the hair's a little greyer, but the defiance and conviction is utterly undimmed.
You have to make a judgment. If there was any possibility that he could develop weapons of mass destruction, we should stop him. That was my view. That was my view then, that's my view now. My judgment is you don't take any risks with this issue.
Made that, I think, very clear.
So what Tony is saying, yes, he accepts there are no weapons of mass destruction, but from what we did discover after we've got there, we did the right thing.
So no apology from Mr. Blair for ousting Saddam or for the chaotic aftermath that ensued, but instead a new argument that the same action may have to be taken again today. He said that Iran's repressive regime, its nuclear weapons program and its links with terrorist groups posed a similar risk that could not be ignored.
I would say that a large part of the destabilization in the Middle East at the present time comes from Iran. The link between Iran having nuclear weapons capability and those types of terrorist organization, it's the combination of that that makes them particularly dangerous.
Tony Blair today was not literally in the dock, but his reputation, his legacy, well, that quite clearly was. But how much has his evidence shed new light or changed any minds?
Most people who will have listened to what Tony Blair had to say today
will have had their suspicions confirmed that when all is said and done, this was a decision that he took to go to war in Iraq to serve the interests of the White House rather than serve the interests of the British people.
Clearly, some of the information that was put in front of Parliament, the dodgy dossier, for instance, was just unacceptable and wrong and shouldn't happen again. But I think we have got to wait for Chilcot's full report before we can come to a full conclusion.
One man who has come to a conclusion is James Sadri, who heckled Mr Blair in the inquiry.
It was just the kind of audacity of Tony Blair to talk about, you know, openly about the fact that 100,000 people that he would accept have died, have been killed, and have no regrets about it. I mean, I think a lot of people in the room, because there was a lot of families, obviously, were feeling really frustrated.
The attention now turns to Gordon Brown, who'll give his own evidence to the inquiry in a few weeks' time. The question is whether he will make the case for war with exactly the same unapologetic gusto as Tony Blair. For unlike his predecessor, Mr Brown has an election to fight. James Landau, BBC News in Downing Street.
Well, our political editor, Nick Robinson, has spent most of the day inside the Iraq inquiry listening to Tony Blair's evidence. He joins us now. Nick, what's your assessment of what Mr Blair had to say?
Well, it's not just what he said, but what he looked like, Fiona, because when you're inside the room, there are things you can see that the cameras don't pick up. We don't control which shots are taken inside the inquiry. When he was arrived, I was struck that I had not seen him looking so frightened for more than 15 years. Indeed, since the moment he ran for the leadership of the Labour Party. His face was stretched taut with anxiety as he went to open a bottle of water before he gave evidence. His hands visibly shook in front of me. But very soon, those nerves were gone. And indeed, far from answering questions that were being posed, he was posing them to the inquiry and to the country as a whole. The 2010 question, as he called it. Imagine he was asking us all to think, what if Saddam was still there? What if we'd lost our nerve? What if he now had the cash as well as the intent and the capacity to develop weapons of mass destruction? And not content with defending an old war, he went on to hint at the possibility of a new one, a conflict with Iran.
Now, he was asked twice at the very end of the hearing today whether or not he had any regrets. He expressed none, not even in relation to the death toll among British soldiers and Iraqi civilians.
No, he knew the question was coming. There had been long hours, 6 hours, of quite technical questions, Fiona, about the structure of government, about the reconstruction effort. But he knew, we all knew, that that question would come at the very end, and he had deliberately decided not to do it. He did refer to the many deaths and insisted they were the responsibility of those who'd taken life, not British soldiers, of course, but those in Al-Qaeda, those from Iran again, who had come into Iran. But it was at that moment that the room erupted. That young man you've just seen shouting out in anger. But at the end, again, not caught by the cameras or the microphones, one woman shouted as Tony Blair left, "You're a liar." Another, "You're a murderer." And as I was escorted from the room, a woman was sobbing next to me and being comforted by other witnesses to today's evidence. I think Tony Blair knew what he was doing today. He is determined that his legacy is not answering some questions about what did or didn't happen 7 years ago. What he wants the country to do is to look to the future, and he wants them to give him credit for being the man who sees the dangers and warn them of it.
Nick Robinson outside the Iraq inquiry, thank you very much. And we'll be hearing from bereaved relatives who attended today's hearing later in the programme. And of course, you can get more information online. That's at bbc.co.uk/news, and there's detailed analysis there and reaction. Other news now, and Toyota has announced it's to recall thousands of cars in the UK because of a potential problem with the accelerator pedal. 8 of its 11 UK models are included in the recall, and car owners will be contacted directly by the company. Our business correspondent Emma Simpson joins me now. Emma, what exactly is the problem with these cars, and how many are affected?
Fiona, the problem is that in a small number of cases, the accelerator pedal's been getting stuck. Now, this defect first emerged in the US. It's a mechanical problem, but obviously a very serious one. So what Toyota has done today is to come out and said which models here in the UK have been affected. So let's take a look at the screen. And as we can see, when they finally come up, we've got a list there that really represents some of this company's best-selling, most popular models in the UK. Look there, the Auris, that sold 30,000 last year alone. Now, this recall covers different time periods for different cars, but none of the cars affected was produced before 2005.
So how many cars are we talking about? What's the scale of this recall?
This recall, it's difficult to think of a car recall that's bigger than this. We could be talking several 100,000 cars. But remember, the UK isn't alone. This is a global problem for Toyota. It's in the process of trying to fix 8 million cars across the world, US, China and Europe. It's a public relations nightmare for them. But what they're saying tonight here in the UK is that the problem is a rare one. They've identified a remedy for it. They're working out how to implement it. And when they do, they'll be contacting customers directly.
Emma, thanks very much. After a further 2 days of talks, there is still no sign of a deal in Northern Ireland, where negotiations to resolve the impasse over the devolution of policing powers continue. The DUP leader, Peter Robinson, says he won't be tied to deadlines or threats from the British and Irish Prime Ministers. The two governments had told the DUP and Sinn Féin to agree a deal by today, or they would publish their own proposals. The High Court has lifted an injunction preventing the media reporting details about the private life of the England and Chelsea captain John Terry. The footballer won an interim order at a private hearing last Friday. A newspaper was about to publish the details of an alleged affair with an unnamed woman. And time is just gone 6:15. Our top story tonight. Tony Blair tells the Iraq Inquiry he still believes it was right to go to war. Coming up, we scale new heights with Freddie Flintoff as he sets up home in Dubai.
Later on BBC London, the teacher who claims he was sacked after warning pupils about their racist remarks. And a box office boom. Why, despite the recession, 2009 was a record year for bums on seats in the West End.
In what has become a familiar and grim ritual in Wootton Bassett, life there came to a standstill this afternoon as the bodies of 2 soldiers killed in Afghanistan were driven through the town. Rifleman Peter Aldridge from the 4th Battalion the Rifles and Lance Corporal Daniel Cooper from the 3rd Battalion the Rifles were flown back to Britain earlier today. The Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall were in the Wiltshire town to show their support. Let's join John Kay, who's there now. John.
Yeah, Fiona, great extremes of emotion here in Wootton Bassett today. Tonight we've had great pride and joy at a royal visit. You can see there the wreaths left by the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall. But earlier, great sorrow at yet another repatriation. How many tears have been shed on this high street? Today, the people of Wootton Bassett came out again to stand shoulder to shoulder with grieving families and friends. Lance Corporal Daniel Cooper served with 3rd Battalion the Rifles. He was killed on foot patrol at the weekend. Described by his mates as a serious soldier, but also a popular, practical joker. Rifleman Peter Aldridge was the 250th member of the British forces killed in Afghanistan, described as a natural leader and role model. The street ceremonies here now attract thousands of people every time, but it wasn't always this way. This footage from 2 years ago shows one of the first gatherings, just a handful of local people with no idea what they were starting. With today's repatriation over, royalty came to Wootton Bassett to pay respect to a town that shows its respect all too often. In the pub, the Prince of Wales and Duchess of Cornwall met some of those who organised the event and attend every single time.
The royal family have recognised the respect that Wootton Bassett stands for, and that's spread right across the nation, and that's something that the people of Wootton Bassett should be very, very proud of.
Icy fingers and snowy ropes meant problems getting the Union flag up. But at least it raised a smile on a high street that could use one. A lot of people have said to us today that they much appreciate having a royal pat on the back today, but they would much prefer it if there had been no repatriations, no grieving families here, and that no royal visit was really necessary. Fiona.
John, thank you. Tennis, and Andy Murray is to face Roger Federer in the final of the Australian Tennis Open in Melbourne on Sunday. The Swiss beat Joe Wilfried Tsonga in their semi-final in straight sets. Federer beat Murray in the final of the US Open in 2008. Now, having retired from Test cricket at the end of last year's Ashes series, Andrew Flintoff says he's ready to take on a new challenge of playing in the Indian Premier League. In preparation, he's moved his family to Dubai, where he's been talking to our sports correspondent, Ollie Foster.
Andrew Flintoff's getting fit again. This was his first time back in the gym since another knee operation 2 weeks ago. He was supposed to be playing in the Indian Premier League in March, then for Lancashire, and ultimately the England one-day side, but the comeback's been delayed by another 6 months.
All of a sudden I'm feeling a bit flabby, a bit fat again, having not done a great deal. And I know for a fact now that in the gym over the next few weeks it's going to be building up, doing all the boring stuff again.
There are pluses, of course, more time with the family. His wife and 3 children have settled in well in Dubai. He fits in his rehabilitation around the school run.
I mean, I know what he's been through, the diets he's been on, everything, and he is so... You're really good. Once you've got something in your mind, he goes for it much better than me.
Why Dubai? Well, geographically, it's the perfect base for his ambition to be a global freelance cricketer. He's been made an official ambassador to help promote the city, a city that may inspire Flintoff in return. It's had its own setbacks, but still tries to do things bigger and better than anyone else.
I remember when I was a kid, my mum and dad took us up Blackpool Tower. I nearly passed out at Blackpool Tower. So, someone might have to catch me in a few minutes.
Thankfully, there were no wobbles as we went up the tallest building in the world.
Oh, great. You don't get stuck there.
And he hasn't wavered in his belief that he can still play at the highest level.
You know, there's a desire to play one-day internationals for England. It seems everyone's got an opinion on whether I will or I won't, but you know, that's down to them. However, I feel that if I'm fit and playing well, I get in England's best side.
There's a big Indian community here, cricket fanatics who recognise one of the sport's biggest stars and what he's achieved. But the Flintoff story isn't finished yet. Ollie Foster, BBC News, Dubai.
More now on our top story, and Tony Blair's appearance before the Iraq Inquiry, which has been long awaited by the families of British troops killed during the conflict. 20 relatives of soldiers who died were allowed into the inquiry today. Our special correspondent, Razia Iqbal, has spoken to some of them.
No, I don't think he did die fighting for a cause.
They do their job, and that job is not to question. Our job is just to support our loved ones.
It may now be almost 7 years since the UK was led to war, but the silent presence of the 179 soldiers who died in Iraq loomed over today's proceedings. The passage of time counts for nothing to those who continue to struggle to come to terms with their loss. Val O'Neill got a ticket to listen to Mr Blair today. Her son Chris died in 2007.
Our main story this morning, Tony Blair has arrived to give evidence to the Iraq Inquiry, which starts...
As she prepared to attend today's inquiry, she wondered if Mr Blair remembered all those who had died.
I look at him and see the life he's living, the conferences he's doing, the talks he's doing, the seminars, the houses he's buying, you know, and you think, hey, it's a nice life. But would it have been a nice life for our children that died? You know, does he ever stop to think that there is 179 children, because that's what they were?
At the conference centre, only some of the relatives got tickets for the main room. The open ballot only allowed 20 families in. Val O'Neill listened to Mr Blair intently.
Every time we looked at his face on the big screen, because obviously he's got his back to us, so we're watching his reactions on the screen, you just think, how could you have done that? How could you have been so autocratic and said, we are going to war, whether the people of this country like it, the Attorney General's solicitors rule it illegal, we have no second UN resolution. I feel really angry.
Sergeant Robert Michael O'Connor died in a Hercules helicopter incident 5 years ago. His sister has a more nuanced view.
When you're a military family, it's your job to love that person of your family that is actually within the armed forces or emergency services, and they do their job, and that job is not to question. Our job is just to support our loved ones.
Peter Briley, though, thinks Mr Blair is a war criminal with blood on his hands. At a service last year, he refused to shake Mr Blair's hand.
There is still some arrogance, but the way that he's acted, you can see that he's not quite comfortable in what he's supposed to have done.
For the bereaved, Mr Blair's momentary discomfort today is in stark contrast to their still raw pain. And while Iraq will exercise historians and experts for years, little changes for the families affected. For them, the fallen are still fallen. Razia Iqbal, BBC News.
Let's talk now to our political editor, Nick Robinson, who's outside the conference centre where Tony Blair appeared today. Nick, one thing Mr Blair said he was sorry for was for having divided public opinion over the war. Do you think he would have done anything to unite opinion behind him after his performance today?
No, not a bit of it, but I'm not sure he could. There are many people who wanted nothing less than a forthright apology for the war. He won't give one because he doesn't have those regrets. Others may have hoped that he would simply express regret for the loss of life. He wasn't prepared to do that. He insists that the war was Saddam Hussein's fault. He had the chance to disarm and he rejected it. He says the deaths after the war were the fault of those, in particular Al-Qaeda and Iran, who entered. Tony Blair was telling us today that he believes we cannot live with the danger of people like Saddam Hussein, countries like Iran in the future. If that divides people, he's chosen to keep them divided.
Nick Robinson, thank you. Well, let's take a look at the weekend weather now with Susan Powell. Get a bit chilly, Susan. In for another cold spell?
Unfortunately so, Fiona. That's definitely the story this weekend. Some beautiful sunshine to go along with the cold weather, though, and that's because the air coming across us is coming straight down from the Arctic. So very clean and clear air, but because it's so cold, as it travels across the warm seas relatively around the UK, we get a lot of showers generated, as we have done today. This is today's radar picture, and they've left quite a lot of moisture around. So through this evening and overnight tonight, as temperatures fall away, the Met Office are concerned for icy roads, particularly in western and eastern exposures of the UK and to the north of Scotland, where there will be more showers as well overnight tonight. And if anything, they will turn increasingly wintry in the north and east. 5 to 10 centimetres of snow possible before we're done. A widespread frost across the UK, so a chilly start to Saturday. Actually, a lot of sunshine around here, and for Northern Ireland, a risk of some snowfall across the Antrim Hills and the Sperrins. If anything, a colder night Saturday night into Sunday, and the focus of the showers shifts towards the west of the UK. The risk of some further snowfall here. Still some snow to come for northern Scotland as well. A quieter story to the east of the UK for Sunday. Perhaps a little bit more cloud around as well, but the main story remains the same, and that is the cold. And it looks like that cold weather will stay with us well on into the next week as well, Fiona.
Thanks, Susan. A reminder of tonight's main news. Tony Blair tells the Iraq Inquiry he still believes it was right to go to war.
In the end, it was divisive. And I'm sorry about that. And I tried my level best to bring people back together again. But if I'm asked whether I believe we are safer, more secure, that Iraq is better, but our own security is better, with Saddam and his two sons out of power and out of office than in office, I believe indeed that we are.
It's nearly 6:30. Stay with us. Now it's time to join the BBC's news teams where you are. Bye-bye.
Tonight on BBC London News.